She's carrying out HIV epidemiological modeling and health economics research to assess optimal resource allocations to minimize new HIV infections and deaths and to maximize access to treatment.
Thank you for the kind introduction and to the committee for the opportunity to present, as well as to the audience for sticking around in the last session and the last day of the meeting. I'm quite excited to be here. So as mentioned, a group at UNSW, together with a group from the National Center for AIDS Prevention in Armenia, wanted to look at optimizing HIV resources in Armenia. And this work was carried out together with our partners at the World Bank, UNAIDS, the Global Fund, and UNDP. So first of all, can I just ask, has anyone from or has lived in or has visited Armenia? One person, that's great. So now that makes two, because I actually got to go to Armenia to do this modeling study back in November. And for those of you that don't know, Armenia is located between Eastern Europe and Western Asia. It's a small country, 3 million people, a lower middle income country, and there are an estimated 3,700 people who are living with HIV. So in 2010, you can say this is a very small epidemic, but actually the peak HIV prevalence among people who injected drugs got up to 10%. The next thing I wanted to show you is that people think in Eastern Europe, the issue for HIV is actually in injecting drug users. And you can see that the peak prevalence of 10%, that was an issue, but it's actually, in terms of the percent of people living with HIV in Armenia, in people who inject drugs, in female sex workers, in MSM, in the traditional key populations, is actually coming down. And right now, predominantly, the prevalence of HIV is in other groups through heterosexual contact. So what are those other groups? So we know that in 2012-13, for the new registered HIV cases, it was almost 60% of those cases were attributed to seasonal labor migrants. So those are people who are Armenians who actually migrate outside of Armenia to find better opportunities for work, who may become infected with HIV. They're unaware of their status. They come back to Armenia, and they may then infect their partners if they don't take the precautions. So in 2012-13, is almost 3/4 of the new registered cases were directly attributed to this migration. So what were our objectives? So we wanted to conduct this modeling study to assess the impact of optimizing HIV resources. So what does that mean? So it's taking your current budget and it's allocating it most effectively across the various HIV programs. And basically the Armenian group wanted to meet their national strategic plans, like most countries, and their targets were to minimize cumulative HIV incidence and AIDS-related deaths by 2020. So we used this modeling study to help them best meet their targets. And secondly, we want to determine what outcomes are required for this migrant program to warrant any increases in funding with the current budget. We know there's increasing HIV prevalence in this group, but what do we actually have to say to justify putting more money into these programs? That's our second objective. So for those of you in the group, is anyone already doing a lot of math modeling or is a modeler? Anyone? One, two, three. Okay, so now that five or so of us do modeling. So as I was introduced, I'm a PhD student, but this is my first year doing this type of modeling. So I needed to learn about modeling, and first you need to know that the model needs, of course, data. So together with the Armenian group, we collated population size data, epi data on HIV prevalence and other aspects, behavioral data, so the number of sexual acts, the number of injections, and we fed all that into the model. The next thing we want to do is, of course, if we're looking at how to best spend their money, we need to know how much money was spent on each HIV program. So we collected this data from 2000 to 2014, and we entered it into our model. So the model is actually called Optima. If you want to hear more about it, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. It's about an hour presentation to go through that model. But in this 10-minute presentation, I'll just basically tell you that what we needed to do is calibrate the model to the epidemic. So that is to fit the model to the trend of the epidemic in Armenia. And while this is very small, I just wanted to demonstrate that the first row is your general population. The HIV prevalence is relatively low and stable. The second row is your key affected populations. patients, female sex workers, the clients, MSM, people who inject drugs, and the last one is prisoners. And you can see that HIV prevalence is either stabilizing or is decreasing in those groups, whereas the second from last frame is in migrants. There's a gradual increase. We also calibrate the model, of course, to first and subsequent line treatment, antiretroviral treatment. Very important to calibrate to that data. So the next thing, and this is where Optima has great strength, is that we generate something called cost outcome curves. And so we relate the program spending, how much is spent on each program, with the actual outcomes that are seen. And I just gave one example. This is real data from Armenia in HIV testing in female sex workers and clients. So, for example, if you spend $250,000 a year, or they did spend, you would, and they got 25% of female sex workers and clients tested. They spent more money, more people were tested. So that's the kind of relationship. And you do see a saturation effect after a certain point. Spending more money doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get increased outcome. And this saturation point was agreed upon together with the collaborative group. So the types of outcome are things like acts covered, people tested, and people on treatment. So we made these curves for each program amongst each population and entered it into the model, and then we carried out our optimization. And I'll show you next our main results. To say that optimization, the Optima model applies an algorithm determined for this given amount of money, what is the optimal mix of HIV program funding. So how do we actually want to allocate our money in the most cost-effective way? And after we do that, what's the best outcome we can achieve? So in Armenia, as I mentioned, their best outcome target is by 2020, they want to minimize cumulative HIV incidence and deaths. So like I said, here are the main results. So you can see the bar on the left, that was the 2013 spending and how it was actually allocated amongst the various HIV programs. You can see the bar in orange, they allocated 17% of their budget to antiretroviral treatment, or ART. And then we did the optimization, and we saw that actually they should be increasing their ART budget by 40% to 24% of their total spending. And if they do that, they would get the maximum benefit. So they should also increase funding to opiate substitution therapy and to programs for female sex workers and their clients. The one thing we did see, and of course we had a lot of discussions with the Armenian group because they were very concerned with their migrant population and the HIV prevalence and transmission in this population, is that the model actually showed that the funding to the migrant programs should stay the same at 5%. So this is something that we wanted to look into further. But first, I'll show you the actual impact of carrying out this optimization. So by 2020, if they were to spend the money in the way that the model suggests, they could actually avert 17% of their new infections and almost 30% of deaths. So that's quite significant for this country and for any country. And so the actual Armenian group has adopted this evidence and incorporated it into their concept note application to the Global Fund. So objective 2, we want to see what outcomes are required in order to warrant increased funding to the seasonal labor migrant HIV programs within the current budget. And I just have a little quote here, and it basically, from Charles Dickens, it says, take nothing on its looks, take everything on evidence. There's no better rule. So we used the evidence that we had, but we still need better evidence. The Armenian group has actually only funded the migrant program for the last 2 years, and we only have outcome data for a few years. We need more data to see the current trends, but to see the actual trend over time. But until then, we carried out a sensitivity analysis where, again, we have the relationship of the spending to the outcome. So if you increase spending, you would need to achieve a certain outcome in order for the program to be cost effective within the context of this optimization. So if you spend $100,000, your outcome should be 20% of the migrants tested, and that's testing to get onto ART. You spend $200,000, you should achieve 50% testing of this migrant program. So we, again, presented these results to the Armenian group, and it was actually, like I said, in Armenia last year amongst a workshop with 6 Eastern Europe and Central Asian countries, and we discussed this result at some length because they were very concerned that we weren't increasing the budget to the migrant program, but it was such an issue in their country. And we said, okay, we don't have a lot of good evidence, but what we see is if you can achieve this outcome, you really can then increase your budget. And you can do this on an annual basis. So at the end of every year, when you know your actual outcome, the number of people tested, you can see whether or not you're reaching your threshold. And you can go forward that way until 2020. And of course, you get more evidence, more data, you feed it back into the model, you can rerun the optimization. To me, it seems fairly simple and very straightforward based on this evidence, and after discussions with the Armenian group, they felt more comfortable. So lastly, in conclusion, our modeling analysis showed that by increasing funding to 2020, you want to increase funding to ART and OST by 40%, and to female sex worker programs by 30%, and to maintain funding through the other programs, including the migrant programs. If you do this, you can actually avert almost 20% of your new infections and 30% of the AIDS-related deaths. As well as in seasonal labor migrant programs, you should ensure at least 50% testing at the current spending, which is $200,000 in this case, to be cost-effective within the optimization context. So I just wanted to thank you. This is actually a picture I've seen from Yerevan, the capital. You can see the Mount Ararat in the background. It's quite a lovely country with very welcoming people, so I encourage all of you to visit it if you get the chance. Thank you.
This paper is now open for questions. Mic number 3, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Carlo from the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition in Latin America. And I just have a question concerning, when you presented the data on 2013 and then the optimization, there was a reduction in the HIV testing for the general population. It was in 2013 8%, and then it was 0%. So I just wondered what was the decision process there?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And when I first presented this to my group, they said, you know, don't go too much into that detail because it was something that was made at the decision level amongst the country. But basically, they weren't going to omit the testing in the general populations, but they actually distributed the testing among key affected populations. So, for instance, in the MSM program, in the female sex worker program, and in the migrant program. So they basically just moved money around. So that is a good point. Why did that purple bar suddenly disappear? But it actually just got absorbed into the other programs. Yeah, it's definitely a good question. Thanks.
If I may, could you tell us about some of the most important assumptions that go into the Optima program, please?
Yeah. I would say the most important assumptions are things like behavior. That behavior isn't going to change over time, and that's regarding sort of some of the epidemiological data. But the most impactful element in at least this model is the relationship between the spending and the coverage or the outcome, and we make some